The city lights twinkled 42 floors below as Margaret Chen sat behind her massive desk, her eyes scanning through endless spreadsheets on her computer screen. It was nearly 9 in the evening, and the building had grown quiet hours ago. Most people had left for their comfortable homes, their warm dinners, their families. But not Margaret. She never left early. Success, she had learned long ago, demanded sacrifice. At 38 years old, Margaret had built herself into something formidable. Her pharmaceutical company wasn't just successful, it was a powerhouse. She had clawed her way up from a middle management position to the executive suite, making hard decisions that others were too soft to make. Fire underperforming teams, cut costs wherever possible, maximize shareholder value. That was the game, and she played it better than anyone. Her wheelchair sat folded near the corner of her office. 5 years had passed since the accident that changed everything. A late night, a tired driver, a moment of lost control. The crash had stolen her ability to walk, but it hadn't stolen her drive. If anything, it had sharpened it. She refused to be pitied. She refused to be seen as weak. Every morning, she wheeled herself into this office and proved that she was still the most powerful person in the building. Tonight, though, something was different. Something was wrong. Margaret had been reviewing the quarterly financial reports when she noticed irregularities in the numbers. Small discrepancies at first. Easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. But Margaret always paid attention. She dug deeper, clicking through folder after folder, her heart rate increasing with each new discovery. Money was moving through the company in ways that didn't make sense. Offshore accounts, shell companies, falsified invoices, someone was stealing from her company. And not just anyone. The trail led directly to David Morrison, her chief financial officer. The man she had trusted with the company's entire financial infrastructure. Her hands trembled slightly as she drafted an email. She kept it brief, professional, devastating. She had evidence. She would be contacting the authorities. He had until morning to explain himself, though they both knew there was no explanation that would save him. She hit send and leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. Tomorrow would be chaos. Board meetings, emergency calls, probably media attention. But that was tomorrow's problem. What Margaret didn't know was that tomorrow's problem was about to become tonight's nightmare. 40 minutes later, the elevator doors on the 42nd floor opened with a soft chime. Margaret glanced up from her computer, confused. The building should have been locked down by now, accessible only with special keycards. She wheeled herself toward her office door, planning to check who was there. She didn't make it. David Morrison appeared in her doorway, his face flushed red, his expensive suit rumpled. Behind him stood 2 men she didn't recognize, large, intimidating, the kind of people who got paid to solve problems with force rather than words. "David," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. "What are you doing here?" "What am I doing here?" Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You just ended my career with that email, Margaret. Did you think I'd just accept that? Did you think I'd go quietly?" He stepped into her office, and the 2 men followed, closing the door behind them. The click of the lock echoed in the suddenly too small space. "You're going to fix this," Morrison said, pulling out a tablet and some papers. "You're going to sign these documents. Transfer authorization. The money goes offshore, and you tell the board it was approved executive compensation. Everyone walks away happy." Margaret's mind raced. The security guard would do his rounds eventually. Someone would notice. She just needed to stay calm. "Buy time, David, this is insane. Even if I sign those, it won't hold up. The board will investigate. You'll go to prison anyway. By the time they figure it out, I'll be on a beach somewhere without extradition treaties," Morrison said. He placed the tablet on her desk. "Sign, now." "No." The word came out stronger than Margaret felt. Morrison's face darkened. He grabbed the handles of her wheelchair and shoved hard. Margaret felt the world tilt as she tumbled sideways, her body hitting the floor with a painful thud. Her wheelchair rolled away and crashed against the wall. Pain shot through her shoulder and hip. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. When she finally found her voice, it came out different than it ever had before. Small, frightened, human. "Please," she gasped, looking up at the 3 men looming over her. "Please don't harm me. I can't walk," the words hung in the air. Margaret Chen, the woman who commanded boardrooms and crushed competitors, lay helpless on her office floor, stripped of every layer of armor she'd spent years building. The vulnerability she'd fought so hard to hide was now impossible to ignore. Morrison stared down at her, and for a moment, something flickered across his face. Doubt, maybe, or disgust at what he was becoming. But then his jaw tightened. "Pick her up," he told one of his men. "We'll do this the hard way if we have to." That's when the office door opened. "Excuse me, is everything okay in here?" All four of them turned. Standing in the doorway was a man in a gray maintenance uniform, holding a mop and bucket. He was in his mid-30s with kind eyes and shoulders that suggested he'd done physical labor his whole life. His name tag read, Thomas Rivera. Thomas had been working the night maintenance shift for 6 months now. After his wife passed away 2 years ago, he'd left his job as an emergency medical technician. The hours had been too unpredictable, and his 6-year-old daughter needed stability. Janitorial work didn't pay as well, but it meant he could drop his daughter at school every morning and pick her up most afternoons. His mother watched her in the evenings while he cleaned offices. He'd been mopping the hallway when he heard raised voices and something crashing. The EMT training never really left you. You learned to recognize the sounds of distress even through closed doors. Now looking at the scene before him, Thomas's training kicked in immediately. Woman on the floor. 3 men standing over her. Overturned wheelchair. This wasn't a business meeting gone wrong. This was dangerous. Building security called up, Thomas said calmly, the lie coming easily. Something about unusual activity on this floor. They asked me to check since I was nearby. It wasn't true, but it didn't need to be. He just needed to create uncertainty, to make these men think twice about whatever they were planning. Morrison's eyes narrowed. "There's no problem here. Just a private business matter. You can go." "Right, of course," Thomas said, but he didn't leave. Instead, he stepped further into the office, setting down his mop bucket. "It's just that, company policy says I need to file a report if I see any kind of accident. Insurance reasons and all that. Looks like the lady took a fall." He moved toward Margaret, positioning himself between her and the 3 men. His movements were casual, non-threatening, but deliberate. Margaret looked up at this stranger in a janitor's uniform, confused and desperate, and clinging to this unexpected interruption like a lifeline. Thomas knelt beside Margaret, his movements calm and practiced. His hands were gentle as he checked her shoulder, his eyes never leaving Morrison and his 2 companions. Years of emergency medical training had taught him how to assess a situation while appearing completely non-threatening. Right now his mind was calculating odds and exits. "Ma'am, can you tell me where it hurts?" Thomas asked, his voice professional but warm. Margaret stared at this stranger who had somehow walked into her nightmare. Something in his eyes told her to trust him, to play along with whatever he was doing. "My shoulder," she managed, "and my hip. The wheelchair rolled away and I fell." Thomas nodded slowly, then glanced up at Morrison. I really should call the on-site medical team. Company policy is pretty strict about workplace injuries, especially on the executive floors. They'll want documentation, photos, incident reports. The whole thing." Morrison's face flushed darker. "That won't be necessary. We'll handle this internally." Sure, Thomas said, pulling out his phone. "I just need to send a quick message to my supervisor. Let him know what's happening. Standard procedure, you understand?" He wasn't messaging his supervisor. He was texting 911, his thumbs moving quickly across the screen while keeping the phone angled so Morrison couldn't see. "Executive assault in progress. Chen Pharmaceutical Building, 42nd floor. Send police quietly." One of Morrison's men stepped forward, his hand reaching toward Thomas. "Put the phone away." Thomas looked up and something shifted in his expression. The friendly janitor facade dropped for just a moment, revealing something harder underneath. "When you'd spent years as an EMT, responding to car crashes and domestic violence calls and overdoses, you learned how to project authority when you needed it." "Listen," Thomas said quietly, standing up to his full height. "I don't know what's going on here, and honestly, I don't want to know. But here's what I do know. Building security reviews camera footage every morning. The elevators log every card swipe with timestamps. My supervisor knows exactly which floor I'm on right now, because the system tracks our location through our work phones." He gestured around the office. "This room probably has cameras too, doesn't it?" "Most executive offices do. So whatever you gentlemen are planning, ask yourselves if it's really worth it when everything's being recorded." It was another bluff. Thomas had no idea if any cameras existed in this office. But doubt was a powerful weapon, and he watched it creep across the faces of Morrison's two hired men. They were muscle, not masterminds. They got paid to intimidate, maybe rough people up a little, but they hadn't signed up for anything that would land them on security footage committing a serious crime. Morrison seemed to sense his plan falling apart. He grabbed the papers off the desk, his jaw clenched tight. "This isn't over, Margaret." "Not by a long shot." "Actually," Thomas said, still standing protectively near Margaret, "I think it might be. Security's probably on their way up right now. You've got maybe 2 minutes to get out of this building before this becomes something you can't walk away from." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then one of Morrison's men shifted nervously, glancing at the door. That was all it took. Morrison cursed under his breath and headed for the exit, his companions following quickly. The moment they were gone, Thomas moved fast. He grabbed Margaret's wheelchair, brought it to her side, and helped her up with practiced efficiency. His hands were strong but careful, supporting her weight exactly where it was needed. "Can you move everything okay?" he asked. "Nothing feels broken?" Margaret shook her head, still processing what had just happened. "I don't think so. Just bruised." "Good, but we need to leave now." Thomas was already moving toward the door, pushing her wheelchair. "If those guys figure out I was bluffing about security, they might come back. And my guess is they're desperate enough to try something stupid." "Where are we going?" Margaret asked. "Somewhere safe. Trust me, trust him." 45 minutes ago, Margaret hadn't even known this man existed. Now he was wheeling her through the executive floor of her own building, past her own office, away from everything familiar. And the strangest part? She did trust him. When you're lying helpless on the floor and a stranger steps between you and danger, something fundamental shifts. Thomas bypassed the main elevators, heading instead toward a door marked, "Maintenance personnel only." Beyond it was a narrow corridor that Margaret had never seen before, despite working in this building for 8 years. "Service elevator," Thomas explained, pressing the call button. "Go straight down to the loading dock. Morrison probably doesn't even know it exists." The elevator arrived with a mechanical groan, nothing like the smooth, silent executive elevators Margaret was used to. Inside, the walls were scuffed metal and it smelled faintly of cleaning supplies. Thomas positioned her wheelchair carefully before pressing the button for the ground floor. As they descended, Margaret found her voice. "Why did you help me?" Thomas glanced at her, surprised by the question. "Why wouldn't I? Most people would have walked away, pretended they didn't see anything. It wasn't your problem." He was quiet for a moment, his expression distant. 2 years ago, my wife Elena was sick. Really sick. We were at a hospital and there was an emergency in the hallway outside her room. Some kind of cardiac arrest. I was sitting by her bed holding her hand, and I heard all this commotion. I wanted to help. I used to be an EMT, but I couldn't leave Elena. She was scared and she needed me there. The elevator shuddered slightly as it descended. Thomas continued. "A nurse saw me through the doorway. She must have recognized something in my face because she came in and said, 'Go, help them. I'll stay with your wife. Nobody should die alone because good people are afraid to act.'" He looked at Margaret directly. "That patient survived because I helped. Elena died 3 weeks later, but those 3 weeks, I got to be with her because that nurse chose to help a stranger. So yeah, when I heard trouble tonight, I couldn't walk away. That's just not who I am." The elevator doors opened to the loading dock. The night air was cool, carrying the smell of rain. Thomas pushed Margaret's wheelchair out onto the concrete, looking around carefully to make sure Morrison's car wasn't waiting. "My apartment is 6 blocks away," Thomas said. "It's not much, but it's safe. We'll wait there while the police sort this out. My daughter's sleeping, so we'll need to be quiet." Margaret started to protest. Surely there was somewhere more appropriate to go, but Thomas was already moving, pushing her wheelchair down the sidewalk. And honestly, where else could she go? Home? Morrison knew where she lived. A hotel? He could find her there too. This janitor's apartment was probably the one place Morrison would never think to look. They moved through the city streets, past closed shops and the occasional late-night pedestrian. Margaret, who normally traveled everywhere in chauffeured cars, was seeing her city from an entirely different angle. At street level. At wheelchair height, she noticed how many buildings had steps but no ramps, how broken the sidewalks were in some areas, making the wheelchair jolt and shake, how some people stared while others looked away quickly, uncomfortable with her presence. "Is it always like this?" she asked quietly. Like what? This hard to just move through the world? Thomas glanced down at her. You mean in a wheelchair? Yeah, pretty much. You learn which routes have good curb cuts, which businesses have accessible entrances. You learn who holds doors and who pretends not to see you. It's a whole different map of the city. They arrived at a modest apartment building, 4 stories, aging brick, the kind of place Margaret would have driven past 1,000 times without really seeing it. Thomas used his key to open the front door, then maneuvered her wheelchair through a narrow hallway to a ground floor unit. Lucky I'm on the first floor, he said, unlocking his apartment. The elevator's broken more often than it works. Inside, the apartment was small but meticulously clean. The living room held a worn couch, a coffee table covered with a child's coloring books, and walls decorated with crayon drawings. One showed a stick-figure family labeled Daddy, Mommy, and Me in uneven letters. Another depicted a rainbow and flowers. A framed photograph sat on a side table. A beautiful woman with warm eyes and dark hair, holding a tiny baby. Elena, Margaret realized. Thomas's wife. The woman who had died while Margaret's company manufactured the drugs that might have saved her. Margaret felt something twist inside her chest, but before she could examine that feeling too closely, Thomas was moving around the kitchen, filling a kettle with water. I'll make tea, he said quietly. Then we should probably tend to those bruises. I've got a first aid kit from my EMT days. He disappeared into what must have been a bedroom, and Margaret heard him whisper, Hey, baby girl, Daddy's home. There's a nice lady visiting for a little while. Go back to sleep, okay? A small, sleepy voice responded. Okay, Daddy, love you. Love you too, Angel. When Thomas returned with the first aid kit, Margaret was crying. She couldn't have explained why if she'd tried. Maybe it was the shock of the evening finally hitting her. Maybe it was the tenderness in Thomas's voice when he spoke to his daughter. Maybe it was sitting in this tiny apartment, surrounded by evidence of love and loss and perseverance, realizing that her own massive penthouse had never felt half as much like a home. Thomas didn't comment on her tears. He just handed her a tissue, made the tea, and sat down with antiseptic and bandages to gently clean the scrapes on her arms where she'd hit the floor. As he worked, Margaret looked around at the careful organization of this small space. Bills stacked neatly on the counter. Sophia's school artwork displayed proudly. Everything clean and maintained despite obvious age and wear. This was what dignity looked like when it didn't come with money or power. How many jobs are you working? Margaret asked suddenly. Thomas paused. 3. Maintenance at your building 5 nights a week, weekend security at a mall, and I deliver food on my bicycle during lunch hours when my mom can watch Sophia. Why? That's almost 80 hours a week. 82 usually, he said matter-of-factly. Sophia needs a better school district. The one she's in now. It's not great. I'm saving for an apartment in a better area. Another year, maybe 2, and we'll have enough. Margaret thought about her own salary, her bonuses, her stock options. She could buy Thomas's dream apartment with a single month's earnings and never notice the money was gone. The police arrived at Thomas's apartment around 11 that night. 2 detectives in plain clothes, their faces tired from what had clearly been a long shift. They took statements from Margaret, asked careful questions about Morrison and his associates, and promised to have officers pick up Morrison before morning. Through it all, Thomas sat quietly on the arm of his couch, occasionally adding details about what he'd witnessed. When the detectives finally left, Margaret expected Thomas to show her to the door, to politely end this strange evening. Instead, he brought out a pillow and blanket. Couch pulls out into a bed, he said. It's not fancy, but it's comfortable enough. You should stay here tonight. Morrison's probably watching your place, and hotels keep records. Tomorrow, when things settle down, you can figure out next steps. Margaret wanted to argue. She was Margaret Chen. She didn't sleep on pull-out couches in janitors' apartments, but exhaustion was pulling at her, and the thought of facing her empty penthouse, of looking over her shoulder at every shadow, made something inside her recoil. Thank you, she said quietly. For everything. Thomas just nodded and headed toward his bedroom. Bathroom's the first door on the left if you need it. I'll be up around 6 to get Sophia ready for school, so try to sleep while you can. Sleep came easier than Margaret expected, probably from sheer emotional exhaustion. She woke to the smell of pancakes and the sound of a child's laughter. Pale morning light filtered through the thin curtains. In the kitchen, Thomas stood at the stove, spatula in hand, while a small girl with dark pigtails sat at the table, swinging her legs and chattering about something that happened at school yesterday. Sophia. She looked just like her mother from the photograph, those same warm eyes and infectious smile. And then Caleb said his dad could beat up anybody's dad, but I said my daddy saves people because he used to be a paramedic. And that's way cooler than... Sophia stopped mid-sentence, noticing Margaret in the doorway. "Oh, hi!" "Sophia, remember your manners," Thomas said gently, plating pancakes. "Hi, I'm Sophia Rivera, and I'm 6 3/4 years old. What's your name?" Margaret wheeled herself closer to the table, charmed despite herself. "I'm Margaret. It's nice to meet you, Sophia. Why do you have a wheelchair?" "Did you hurt your legs?" "Sophia," Thomas began, but Margaret held up a hand. "It's okay. Yes, I was in an accident a few years ago, and my legs don't work the way they used to, so I use the wheelchair to get around." Sophia considered this seriously, then nodded. "My friend Christopher at school uses a wheelchair too. He's really good at wheelchair basketball. Can you play basketball?" "I've never tried," Margaret admitted. "You should. Christopher says it's super fun." Sophia took a big bite of pancake syrup dribbling down her chin. "Are you my daddy's friend?" Margaret glanced at Thomas, who was watching the interaction with an unreadable expression. "I think I might be," she said. After breakfast, Thomas walked Sophia to school while Margaret made phone calls from his apartment. Her assistant, her lawyer, the board of directors. Morrison had been arrested at his home that morning without incident. The company was in crisis mode but functioning. Margaret told them she'd be back in the office by afternoon. When Thomas returned, he found Margaret staring at her laptop screen, her expression troubled. "Everything okay?" he asked. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Thomas, last night when you told me about your wife..." "What disease did she have?" He stiffened slightly. "Why, please. It's important." Thomas sighed, pouring himself coffee. "Stage 4 ovarian cancer. By the time they caught it, it had spread. The doctors said there was a treatment that might help, a newer drug that was showing promise in trials. But our insurance denied it, said it was experimental, not proven enough. We appealed 3 times. Each appeal took weeks. By the time the 3rd denial came through, he didn't finish. He didn't need to." Margaret's fingers were shaking slightly as she turned the laptop to face him. "This drug, was it Oncovex T?" "Yeah, that sounds right. How did you..." Thomas's eyes widened as he looked at the screen. "That's your company. My company manufactures it. And according to these internal emails I'm reading, our insurance division has a policy of automatically denying coverage for it on 1st and 2nd appeal, regardless of medical necessity. It's a cost-saving measure. They count on most people giving up or running out of time." The silence that followed was heavy. Thomas stood frozen, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. "The drug that might have saved Elena," Margaret continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "was sitting in our warehouses while my insurance department deliberately delayed approval. I signed off on those policies, Thomas. I approved the cost-cutting measures. I never asked what they actually meant." Thomas set down his coffee very carefully. When he spoke, his voice was controlled, but Margaret could hear the pain underneath. "Do you know how much it costs to manufacture a dose of that drug?" "I don't look at manufacturing costs." "That's $47, Thomas interrupted. "I looked it up after Elena died. $47 to make. Your company charges insurance companies $16,000 per dose. Elena needed 12 doses over 6 months. That's almost $200,000 for something that cost you less than $600 to produce." Margaret felt like she'd been slapped. "That can't be right. The research and development costs were paid off in the first 18 months after FDA approval, according to your own investor reports. I read everything I could find about your company after Elena died. I wanted to understand why the medicine existed, but my wife couldn't have it." He walked to the window, his back to her. "I'm not naive, Margaret. I know pharmaceutical companies need to make profit. I know research is expensive. But there's profit, and then there's whatever you call this. Letting people die while the medicine they need collects dust because they don't have the right insurance or enough money." Margaret wanted to defend herself, to explain the complexity of pharmaceutical economics, regulatory environments, investor expectations, but the arguments that had always seemed so logical in boardrooms felt hollow here. In this small apartment, facing a man whose wife had died while her company hoarded a drug that might have saved her. "I didn't know," she said finally. "That's not an excuse, I know. But I genuinely didn't know it was this bad. Thomas turned back to her. Maybe that's the problem. You didn't know because you didn't want to know. It was easier to focus on stock prices and quarterly earnings than to think about the people on the other side of those denials. When Thomas returned, he found Margaret staring at her laptop screen, her expression troubled. "Everything okay?" he asked. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Thomas, last night when you told me about your wife, what disease did she have?" He stiffened slightly. "Why, please?" "It's important," Thomas sighed, pouring himself coffee. "Stage 4 ovarian cancer. By the time they caught it, it had spread. The doctors said there was a treatment that might help, a newer drug that was showing promise in trials. But our insurance denied it, said it was experimental, not proven enough. We appealed 3 times. Each appeal took weeks. By the time the third denial came through, he didn't finish. He didn't need to." Margaret's fingers were shaking slightly as she turned the laptop to face him. "This drug, was it Oncovex T?" "Yeah, that sounds right." "How did you—" Thomas's eyes widened as he looked at the screen. "That's your company. My company manufactures it. And according to these internal emails I'm reading, our insurance division has a policy of automatically denying coverage for it on first and second appeal, regardless of medical necessity. It's a cost-saving measure. They count on most people giving up or running out of time." The silence that followed was heavy. Thomas stood frozen, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. "The drug that might have saved Elena," Margaret continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "was sitting in our warehouses while my insurance department deliberately delayed approval. I signed off on those policies, Thomas. I approved the cost-cutting measures. I never asked what they actually meant." Thomas set down his coffee very carefully. When he spoke, his voice was controlled, but Margaret could hear the pain underneath. "Do you know how much it costs to manufacture a dose of that drug?" "I don't look at manufacturing costs." "That's $47, Thomas interrupted. "I looked it up after Elena died. $47 to make. Your company charges insurance companies $16,000 per dose. Elena needed 12 doses over 6 months. That's almost $200,000 for something that cost you less than $600 to produce." Margaret felt like she'd been slapped. That can't be right. The research and development costs were paid off in the first 18 months after FDA approval, according to your own investor reports. I read everything I could find about your company after Elena died. I wanted to understand why the medicine existed, but my wife couldn't have it. He walked to the window, his back to her. "I'm not naive, Margaret. I know pharmaceutical companies need to make profit. I know research is expensive. But there's profit and then there's whatever you call this. Letting people die while the medicine they need collects dust because they don't have the right insurance or enough money." Margaret wanted to defend herself, to explain the complexity of pharmaceutical economics, regulatory environments, investor expectations, but the arguments that had always seemed so logical in boardrooms felt hollow here, in this small apartment, facing a man whose wife had died while her company hoarded a drug that might have saved her. "I didn't know," she said finally. "That's not an excuse, I know. But I genuinely didn't know it was this bad." Thomas turned back to her. "Maybe that's the problem. You didn't know because you didn't want to know. It was easier to focus on stock prices and quarterly earnings than to think about the people on the other side of those denials." He wasn't wrong. Margaret had spent years insulating herself from the human cost of her decisions. Every time someone brought up patient advocacy or drug pricing, she'd redirected the conversation to shareholder value and fiduciary responsibility. She'd convinced herself that emotions had no place in business decisions, but emotions were just another word for consequences when those consequences involved human lives. "Thomas," she said carefully, "if you could change anything about how my company operates, what would it be?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Why are you asking me? I clean offices for a living. What do I know about running a pharmaceutical company? You know what it's like on the other side. You know what it feels like to watch someone you love suffer, while bureaucrats shuffle papers. That's knowledge I don't have," she paused. "I'm not just making conversation here. Morrison's gone, which means I need a new CFO. But more than that, I need to understand what we've been doing wrong. Really understand it, not just read sanitized reports. You want me to help you?" Thomas shook his head. "Margaret, I barely finished college. I spent years driving ambulances and now I mop floors. I'm not qualified to advise a Fortune 500 company. Maybe that's exactly why I need your perspective. Before Thomas could respond, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and his expression shifted to concern. It's Sophia's school. I need to take this. Margaret wheeled herself to the window while Thomas talked in low tones. Outside, the city was fully awake now. People hurried along sidewalks. Cars honked in traffic, delivery trucks double-parked. From 42 floors up in her office, all of this was abstract, almost invisible. Down here, it was immediate and real. Sophia fell on the playground, Thomas said, hanging up. Twisted her ankle. The school nurse says it's probably not serious, but they want someone to pick her up. I'm sorry, I need to go, Margaret said immediately. I'll be fine here. Thomas hesitated, clearly torn between responsibility to his daughter and his unexpected house guest. Margaret made the decision for him. Thomas, go get your daughter. I'm a grown woman who just survived an assault attempt. I think I can handle sitting in your apartment for an hour. When he still didn't move, she added more softly, Please, Sophia needs her father. I had mine growing up, and I know how much that matters. That broke through. Thomas grabbed his keys and jacket, then paused at the door. There's leftover pizza in the fridge if you get hungry. I'll be back as soon as I can. Alone in the apartment, Margaret did something she hadn't done in years. She looked around at how someone else lived. Really looked. The furniture was old but cared for. The carpet was worn but vacuumed. Sophia's toys were organized in plastic bins. Her clothes hung neatly in the small closet visible through the open bedroom door. On the refrigerator, held by magnets, were Sophia's test papers, all marked with stars and smiley faces and teacher comments like, great effort, and wonderful work. There was also a calendar, and Margaret found herself reading it. Sophia's soccer practice on Tuesdays and Thursdays, library day every Wednesday, parent-teacher conferences marked in red, Thomas's work schedule color-coded around everything else. Every single one of his 3 jobs carefully arranged so he could still be present for his daughter. This was what love looked like when it wasn't convenient. When it required sacrifice and effort and choosing to show up even when you were exhausted. Margaret thought about her own life. Her penthouse apartment decorated by professionals. Her calendar managed by an assistant. Her success built on 80-hour work weeks and ruthless prioritization of business over everything else. She told herself she was building something important, creating value, making tough choices that softer people couldn't make. But what had she actually built? A company that let women like Elena die while medicines sat in warehouses. A fortune that she spent on things she didn't need, while men like Thomas worked 3 jobs to afford a safe neighborhood for their children. A reputation for strength that crumbled the moment she was knocked out of her wheelchair and forced to beg for mercy. Her phone buzzed. Another message from her assistant. The board wanted an emergency meeting this afternoon. Investors were nervous about Morrison's arrest. The media was asking questions. Margaret stared at the message for a long moment, then made a decision that would have been unthinkable 48 hours ago. She started typing. Thomas returned an hour later with Sophia limping beside him, her ankle wrapped in an elastic bandage and her face lit up with the pride that only a 6-year-old with a minor injury can display. The nurse said I was very brave, Sophia announced, hopping on one foot into the apartment. And Daddy got me ice cream even though it's not dessert time. Special circumstances, Thomas said with a small smile, then noticed Margaret still sitting by the window, her laptop closed, staring out at the street below. Everything okay? Margaret turned to face him, and something in her expression had changed. There was a determination there that went beyond her usual boardroom confidence. This was something deeper, almost desperate. I need to show you something, she said. But first, Sophia, how would you feel about watching a movie in your room for a little while? I need to talk to your daddy about grown-up stuff. Sophia's eyes lit up. Can I watch the princess one? You can watch whatever you want, Thomas said, setting her up in her bedroom with her tablet and headphones. When he returned to the living room, Margaret had opened her laptop again. I spent the last hour going through company files, she said without preamble. Insurance denials, pricing structures, patient assistance programs, or the lack thereof. Thomas, it's worse than I thought. The drug that Elena needed? We deny initial coverage for it 87% of the time. Not because it doesn't work, but because our actuaries determined that most people won't make it through the full appeals process. She pulled up a spreadsheet, her hands shaking slightly. See these numbers? This is how many people request coverage. This is how many get approved on first try. Second try, Third try, the percentages drop dramatically at each stage because people either give up, switch to cheaper alternatives that don't work as well, or... She couldn't finish the sentence. They die, Thomas said flatly. Like Elena. Like Elena, Margaret repeated. And there are dozens of other drugs with similar patterns. It's not just one medication. It's systematic. We've built an entire business model around the idea that sick people will eventually stop fighting. Thomas sat down heavily on the couch. So what are you going to do about it? I'm going to change it. All of it. Margaret's voice was firm. I've already sent an email to the board calling an emergency meeting for tomorrow. I'm proposing a complete overhaul of our patient assistance programs, new pricing structures, and an independent review of every insurance denial from the past 3 years. They'll never agree to that. Your shareholders will revolt. Probably, Margaret admitted, which is why I'm also prepared to resign if necessary. But I'm not going to resign quietly. I'll take this public. Show the media exactly what we've been doing. Make enough noise that they can't just bury it and go back to business as usual. Thomas stared at her. You'd destroy your own career? I'd salvage what's left of my conscience, Margaret said. Thomas, last night when I was on that floor begging Morrison not to hurt me, I felt completely powerless. That's how you felt watching Elena die, isn't it? Powerless. Knowing the solution exists but not being able to reach it. Thomas nodded slowly, his jaw tight. I can't bring Elena back, Margaret continued, her voice breaking slightly. But I can make sure that other families don't go through what you went through. That has to count for something. Before Thomas could respond, Margaret's phone rang. Her assistant's name flashed on the screen. She answered on speaker. Margaret, where are you? The board is furious. Morrison's arrest is all over the financial news and our stock price is dropping. We need damage control now. Tell the board I'll be there at 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, Margaret said calmly. And I need you to pull together every document we have on patient assistance programs, drug pricing, and insurance claim denials for the past 5 years, everything. That's thousands of documents, then you'd better start now. Also, I need you to schedule a press conference for tomorrow evening. Major outlets only. There was a long pause. Margaret, what are you planning? I'm planning to tell the truth. For once. She hung up before her assistant could argue further. Thomas was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Respect, maybe. Or disbelief. Possibly both. You're really going to do this, he said. I'm really going to try. Margaret closed her laptop. But I need your help. I need someone who can explain to that board, to the media, to the public, what these policies actually mean for real people. Someone who lived through it. Would you be willing to tell Elena's story? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. That's a private thing. Our story. I don't know if I want it turned into some corporate publicity stunt. It wouldn't be that, Margaret said quickly. I'm not trying to use your pain to make myself look better. I'm trying to make people understand what we've done. The board members see spreadsheets and profit margins. They need to see faces, hear names. Elena wasn't a statistic. She was a person. Your person. Thomas stood and walked to the photograph on the side table, picking it up gently. His thumb traced the outline of Elena's face through the glass. She was funny, he said quietly. That's what people didn't always see right away. She had this ridiculous sense of humor. She'd make jokes even when she was in pain, even near the end. The last thing she ever said to me was a joke about the hospital food. He set the photo down carefully. If I do this, if I tell our story, it can't be sanitized. I won't pretend it was peaceful or dignified or any of those comfortable lies people tell about cancer. It was ugly and painful and terrifying, and she fought so hard for a treatment she never got to try. That's the truth. Can you handle that truth? I think I need to, Margaret said. The next afternoon, Margaret wheeled herself into the boardroom of Chen Pharmaceutical for what might be the last time as CEO. 15 board members sat around the massive conference table, their expressions ranging from concern to hostile. Thomas sat beside her, uncomfortable in his one good suit, his calloused hands folded on the table. Margaret didn't waste time with pleasantries. She pulled up her presentation, slide after slide of data, policies, and most damning of all, patient stories, names, faces, people who had died while waiting for approvals that never came. This is what we've built, she said, her voice steady, a system that prioritizes profit over people. I'm not naive. I know we need to be profitable to stay in business. But there's a difference between sustainable profit and exploitative profit. We crossed that line years ago, and I was too focused on quarterly earnings to notice. Board member Richard Chen, no relation, despite the shared surname, leaned forward. Margaret, we all understand this is emotional after your ordeal with Morrison, but we can't make business decisions based on emotion. Our fiduciary duty is to shareholders. Our duty is also to do no harm, Margaret shot back. Or did we forget that pharmaceutical companies exist to heal people, not just to generate returns? Another board member, Patricia Walsh, shook her head. If we implement the changes you're proposing, reducing prices, expanding patient assistance, reviewing every denial, our profit margin drops by at least 30%. Shareholders will demand our heads. Then let them, Margaret said. I'd rather lose my position than continue running a company that functions as a barrier between sick people and the medicine they need. That's when Thomas spoke up. His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. My wife's name was Elena Rivera, he said. She was a teacher, 2nd grade. Every year she bought school supplies out of her own pocket for kids whose families couldn't afford them. She volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends. She made the world better just by being in it. He pulled out a folder and opened it, revealing medical documents. When she got sick, we did everything right. We had insurance through her school district. We followed every procedure. We filed appeals with all the proper documentation, and at every step your company said no. Not because the treatment wouldn't work. Your own research showed it was effective, but because it cost too much to approve. Thomas looked around the table, meeting each board member's eyes. Elena died on a Tuesday morning in March. She was 33 years old. Our daughter was 4. The last thing Elena said to me was, "Take care of our baby girl." And I have. I work 3 jobs to give Sophia a decent life, but I can't bring back her mother. He pushed the folder across the table. There are 87 other families in this folder. 87 people who requested the same drug Elena needed in the same year, from the same insurance division. Only 12 got approved. You want to know what happened to the other 75? 43 died. 28 switched to alternative treatments that didn't work as well. 4 went bankrupt paying out of pocket. The room was completely silent. Ms. Chen asked me to tell you what your policies actually mean. Thomas continued. They mean children growing up without parents. They mean families choosing between medicine and rent. They mean people dying while knowing the cure exists, but they just can't reach it. That's what your 30% profit margin costs. Patricia Walsh looked shaken. The data doesn't show it like that. Because you don't want to see it like that, Margaret said. We've hidden behind numbers and percentages and corporate language for so long that we forgot we're dealing with human lives. I'm done with that. Tomorrow I'm holding a press conference to announce major policy changes. The board can support these changes or you can remove me. But either way, the truth is coming out. Richard Chen stood up. Margaret, if you do this, you're finished in this industry. No pharmaceutical company will touch you. Good, Margaret said simply. Maybe this industry needs fewer people like me and more people willing to remember why we got into healthcare in the first place. The vote wasn't even close. By the end of the week, Margaret was out as CEO, though she'd negotiated a settlement that implemented several key reforms. The new patient assistance program, independent review of denials, price reductions on 12 essential medications. It wasn't everything she'd hoped for, but it was something. 3 months later, Margaret stood in a small office space in a modest building downtown, far from the gleaming corporate towers she'd once commanded. The sign on the door read, Rivera Chen Foundation for Medical Access. Thomas was at a desk across the room on the phone with someone whose insurance had just denied coverage for a cancer treatment. His voice was patient, knowledgeable, walking them through the appeals process, connecting them with resources. Sophia sat in the corner at her own small desk, carefully stamping envelopes with return address labels. She'd appointed herself official mail helper and took the job very seriously. Margaret's settlement from the company had been substantial, and she'd used most of it to start this foundation. Thomas had quit 2 of his 3 jobs to work here full-time as community outreach director. He still did weekend security. Keeps me grounded, he said, but now he could actually be present for Sophia's life. The foundation wasn't flashy. They couldn't save everyone, but they'd helped 43 families navigate insurance denials in just 3 months. 43 families who might have ended up like Thomas and Elena. Ms. Chen? Sophia appeared at Margaret's elbow, holding up an envelope. Is this one ready to mail? Margaret examined it with mock seriousness. Perfect work, Sophia. You're very good at this job. Sophia beamed. Daddy says we're helping people feel better. Like how medicine makes you feel better when you're sick. That's exactly what we're doing, Margaret agreed. Sophia hesitated, then asked shyly, Can I tell you something? Of course. I'm glad you use a wheelchair like my friend Christopher. It made me not scared to talk to you the first day. And now you're like family, kind of. Is that okay to say? Margaret felt her throat tighten. That's more than okay, sweetheart. That's perfect. After Sophia returned to her stamping station, Thomas came over, having finished his call. That was the Henderson family, he said. Their son needs the same drug Elena did. We got them connected with a lawyer who specializes in insurance appeals. He thinks they have a strong case. Good, Margaret said. She was quiet for a moment, then added, Do you ever regret it? Helping me that night? Your life would be simpler if you just walked past my office. Thomas considered the question seriously. Simpler? Maybe better? No. He glanced over at Sophia, who was humming while she worked. She's got a college fund now because of your foundation salary. I tuck her in at night instead of leaving for my second shift. And yeah, the work is hard, but it matters. Elena would have loved knowing we're doing this. I think she'd be proud of you, Margaret said softly. She'd be proud of both of us. Thomas corrected. You gave up everything you built to do this. That takes courage. Margaret looked around the small office, so different from her old corner suite with its view of the city. No expensive art on these walls, just photos of families they'd helped. No executive assistants or board meetings, just her, Thomas, and Sophia trying to fix a broken system one case at a time. I didn't give up everything, Margaret said. I gave up the things that didn't matter to find the things that do. Through the window, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the office. Sophia started singing quietly to herself while she worked. Thomas returned to his desk to answer another call, and Margaret opened her laptop to review the next case file, ready to fight another battle in a war that would never fully be won but was worth fighting anyway. 6 months ago, she'd been lying on an office floor, pleading for mercy, certain her life was ending. In a way, it had. But something else had begun, something smaller and harder and infinitely more meaningful than anything she'd built in that gleaming tower. She'd been saved by a janitor who chose to help when he could have walked away. Now every day she tried to honor that gift by making the same choice he'd made, to act when action was needed, to help when help was possible, to remember that behind every policy and percentage was a person who mattered. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was finally a life she could be proud of.